Hey everybody, I was just doing some yard work. I have a lot of dead trees and things like that just in the yard, and I actually have a wood burner, so kind of cleaning up the area here and in the hopes of burning some wood on the weekends when I'm not at work. I had a lot of time just to think to myself. I really enjoy those moments where I just do some sort of task where I can more or less shut my brain off. I mean, I'm thinking about the thing that I'm doing, but you just get into the labor that you're performing, and it's just mostly raw, moving stuff around and cutting things up as I'm doing today. And I sort of realized as I was doing this that I sort of love this Puritan work ethic thing, and I have it sort of baked into me, and I realized that I was raised Lutheran, and my mom she taught me to have this really good work ethic, and that you can free yourself with hard work. And she's right. I have done that in my life. I just sort of realized that, it was just nice to be outside and be working and just appreciate life. The fact that I have an able body and I can move around and do things like that. And I'm very thankful for the work ethic that my mom gave me. But I just thought it was funny that it does sort of mirror some kind of Puritan work ethic. And it got me to thinking that is probably one of the best things that I could try to preach to people, is that you can improve your condition by working for yourself, and you sort of create wealth in the world by giving value to people. It's not a zero-sum game in the trade of goods, which most of our interactions are just voluntary things to satisfy the uneasiness of somebody else, even if it's an act of charity. Whether or not there is any sort of resource or capital to gain on your end, if you act on behalf of charity, I think you are getting a benefit out of that, and you are trading your labor for some sort of value in your own conscience or in your heart, whatever you want to call it. I was also wondering about what other people think who are not in my political camp. So I put out on Facebook a request to take questions from my friends list. And a big reason why I'm doing this is I heard a term recently that I really kind of liked, and it's called steel manning. If I'm to expect people to view libertarianism through the lens that I do, in this sort of nuanced perspective of how we could do things a lot differently than we are now, and a lot of the same core services that people are worried about not existing, I believe will be provided for because people have a demand for them. Just the way that people get really scared when you talk about it is sort of faith in that idea that people will organize around things like fire control and policing in some sort of voluntary way that could be done a lot better than through the fiat and cartelization of labor unions. And in this way, I sort of hope to bridge this gap of understanding that the current environment that we're in sort of incentivizes. And social media, if we were to have it, I think we should at least have some people out there who are trying to be responsible with that tool, because it's very powerful. And I think that's been demonstrated throughout the world now, where we have things like the Arab Spring and the Panama Papers, where information gets released on the internet and it just sort of changes the culture in this sort of way, where it gives this perspective of what's going on behind the curtain. Another example, I suppose, would be the WikiLeaks releasing of collateral murder of then Bradley Manning's cable leak. And that was a big one for me. It turned me into an anti-war leftist, more or less. At that time, I was very progressive when I was a teenager, and I was even reading things like Kropotkin and Marx and Engels. What really sort of changed that for me was seeing that, and then not long after that, maybe a year later, is when Ron Paul was running for presidency under the GOP, and it just sort of changed my mind on what conservatism is, because there was this old man who was this sort of old school Protestant guy who's really against war. He almost seemed like a Quaker, and I always had this sort of fondness for the Quaker mentality of, but I would say just more measured and a very high threshold and a low tolerance for violence. So I've always just thought that was really cool. When I was researching religions, Quakerism just sort of seemed attractive to me as part of the Christian lexicon. So what I'm sort of getting at here is that I had my mind changed on this incredibly big issue through this medium of the internet. And it is my opinion that we have to be very careful with that apparatus. One of those responsibilities that I am starting to really want to adopt is steel manning, where you give the best argument for your opponent's side, as I was saying earlier, because I do expect that in return. So that is the general idea of this show. And I think that's where I've finally found my niche, more or less, and the direction that I'd like to go. The show has evolved a lot since its inception. And just to give a little bit of background and let you peek behind the curtain, at first I wanted to do a human interest broadcast format where I would interview just normal people and ask them about music that has changed their lives. And in that process, I learned that intellectual property is a very complicated matter in podcasting because you actually have to buy what is called the mechanical license for music. Now, lately I've been playing copyrighted music on here a little bit, but I always have audio over that, and I only play short segments of it, so I'm just hoping that that things don't blow up in my face, and if they do, I guess I'll deal with that when it comes. And I know I'm walking kind of a thin line there, but I'm trying really hard to get listenership. And that's sort of another reason why I'm doing this. I feel like engagement with any kind of audience, and even if I have to reach out to potential audiences and aggregate questions more or less, perhaps that will generate new interest in the show. The new goal here really is going to be to reach these cultural divides where we could spread these ideas that we find so important to us, and not watering them down at all, but just communicating that we care as much as these other people care about their issues. We just think that they are creating their own problems. For example, the neoconservatives are always complaining about the rise of jihadist movements in the Middle East, which threaten Western powers with terrorism. However, the interventions in which they promote to take care of the past regime's problems create more terrorists. This concept is called blowback. Another thing that I learned very strongly from Ron Paul, and basically from growing up during the Bush administration, right in the wake of 9/11. I'm not sure if I released the episode necessarily on 9/11, on my 9/11 story. I don't remember if I actually did that or not, but I did record something, and basically I was saying how I was in 6th grade when that happened, and I was in social studies class, believe it or not, and basically it was just a very interesting moment where I didn't know what was going on at the time, but I was coming of age in the wake of that. So if you could put yourself in my shoes, I guess I would have been like, what are you in? I guess I would have been 6th grade, so I was 12 years old. I came of age as a young adult after that, so my whole adult life and adolescence really has been in this world war on terror, and I've seen the consequences. You didn't see all of these foreign Muslims coming in and destroying buildings and blowing up venues and things like that. until quite a while after that. It's just interesting to note, and I just can't help but see the rise in the foreign intervention in the Middle East. And it is apparent to me that 9/11 was the epitome of blowback, and it should have been the greatest lesson that we had ever learned, and we missed that opportunity, and we miss those opportunities every day when we don't point them out and when we don't talk about them. And if there's anything I can get through to people on the left, it's that hopefully they could adopt this idea of being anti-war again, because I think the previous administration, they loved Obama so much because of his charisma and the promises that he made for domestic policy, but he kept up and even worsened the drone wars. I have another story to share with you on that front. I ran into a drone pilot at a party I was at, actually, last winter. He was a pretty nice guy, very much in the sort of social justice camp, but he was a decent person. And I just have to say that these people are complicated. And the more you actually get to know somebody who you thought that you know, I hate to use the word hate, but someone that you vehemently disagree with. This guy sits in an office and drives drones around. Perhaps mostly for surveillance. He didn't give me very many details. But we talked about the air wars. And it was a very dark and uncomfortable conversation. I pushed on him pretty hard and basically was telling him that I disagree with this very much and that I'm quite in the camp of anti-war. And we managed to keep it very civil, and it was great. But he said some things that really disturbed me. He said, when I was talking about the collateral damage rate, which is nearing 90%, they assume in some cases, figures are that high, that unintended targets make up 90% of the fatalities. And he tells me that nobody that's given shelter by their targets are good people, because they're all complicit in what they're doing. And it just made my heart sink to know that this person has to adjust their perception of reality to that degree where they completely dance around the idea that they're killing innocent people at a rate that is just astronomical. People who are also taken victims by the intended targets. ISIS will go into a town and take over and rule over this community, trying to install their caliphate. Those people are victims. I don't think that most people in the Middle East really want that sort of existence. I think it is sort of a fringe minority who are going around doing these kinds of things and become the warlords and all these kinds of things. Now, granted, I understand the cultural problem with Islam. I really don't want to get into that specifically, but I'm just saying that I think there is just something human about even people in these sort of places where they really haven't changed very much technologically since, you know, this sort of post-biblical era, besides these munitions that find their way into these places. And I'm talking to him, and, you know, there are just a lot of comments like that that make me really, you know, it sort of drops my hope in humanity for the people in those positions to just have that perception. You know, I really shouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's a defense mechanism. They have to think about it that way, otherwise they would be troubled and couldn't sleep. And, you know, this guy had a kid, and, you know, in some way, when you get to know someone that you don't like very well, you start to actually, like, have affection and sympathy for them, okay? And it's very strange when that happens to you, and I think those are moments that you grow a lot from. And I mean, if you guys know me very well, you know that I'm very anti-war, and to talk to a drone pilot who, for all I know, he may actually, whether or not he just runs recon and does intelligence, he's gathering information for a raid on these places. So in some way, he's complicit in this program of, you know, basically conspiring against people in the Middle East. And you just have to wonder how many of them are innocent and how that has to play on his conscience way underneath of all of that. So I know that he was adjusting his reality as we were talking, because I don't think that most people actually push back on him like that. I mean, I showed the person respect, right? But I don't worship people in the military. At the same time, I very much respect them because I have people in my family who are in the military, and, you know, it's just sort of this thing that's in the back of my mind that, you know, you sort of have to in a way. But I don't glorify them anymore like I used to when I was younger. I sort of have this more nuanced take on it that, you know, a lot of the people who come back from some of these unwinnable wars will recount their stories about how we're actually making things worse. A lot of them become libertarians. There is a heavy saturation of more right-wing constitutionalists who find their home in liberty movements. And I'm completely fine with that because I am more in line with them than most of the people. And I think I agree with them a lot on, you know, the foreign policy issue. And if you stand with me on that one issue, I think we can set aside pretty much everything. Because from my perspective, when we go to another country and destroy property, and the most valuable property that people have, the right to their body and their life, in my opinion, that is the worst thing that a government can do. And we should only ever do that in the most dire of circumstances if we are to have that sort of system, right? And I realize the world is not perfect and that probably won't happen, but we should always strive for that. We should always strive for peace when we can, and that isn't to make it sound weak. That's why I often don't even use that word peace, because I think peace is sort of an illusion on some long-term scale. The failure rate of peace is quite unfortunately low. It only lasts in very short stints globally, is what I'm talking about. However, we have to realize that where civilized society comes from is in market interactions and in the voluntary things that we all do every day, which is a vast majority of things. If you think about it, how many things that you do in your everyday life have to do with force? Of course, there is that underlying racket that taxes you and takes a portion of your income, and we acquiesce to that as they go and bomb foreign places to allegedly keep us safe. But it seems to me that we should be a little bit more pissed about that. And when I see all these allegations of sexual assault, and believe me, I'm totally against, you know, doing things against people's consent with their own body. Like I said, that's the most important property right that you have. But I can't help but think that we're so locked in our everyday lives here in America that we don't realize the worst things that are being done are happening almost with our consent by not talking about and criticizing these things and not kicking out these bums that let it happen. The legislative branch has basically handed over complete power to the executive branch and their sort of autonomous bureaucracies like the FBI and the CIA. And they just run roughshod over the rest of the world with our tax dollars in some sort of roundabout way. It's more through fiat and through the digital printing of money. And I picked the show title Subversion for the reason that, like I was saying earlier, I was trying to sort of undermine the common way that we consume music, right? Because to me, it was such a big part of my life, and I think it drove this spirit that I have of just generally overcoming odds and empowering myself, more or less. So I just wonder what influences other people and how the media that they consume really makes them the person that they are today. So with that all being said, the direction that I'm taking this show is to engage in that apparatus and learn a little bit more about how I can have an influence on it and hopefully get other people to sort of perfect their means of communicating in that manner. And the way I see it, the most subversive thing we can do is be civil with each other, because ultimately at the end of the day, my entire philosophy boils down to how I want things to be consensual and things to be as peaceful as possible. So here I am trying to engage with normal people, and I know that I have a quite radical political ideology that I hold, but I hope that I can continue to get along with people very well, and I mostly do. The people that really disagree with me, I don't know, it's a very interesting thing when someone just has this emotional outrage just directed at you. You've known them for years and you really like them, but they just can't get over how evil they think that you are because you don't want to support some certain policy. And I think it's just because they do not really understand exactly where I'm coming from and why my entire philosophy is driven by this recognition that the government is the social apparatus of violence, and we should have a very high threshold for what we tolerate that entity doing. And it's many parts. Because even though, even down to the local level, government is fractured into the reality that it is exactly that, the social apparatus of violence, and that even when it's monopolized on that local level, it can have terrible consequences just because it loosens the responsibility that people engaged in that activity have, because they have the shield of law behind them. And like I was saying earlier, unions and police unions in particular have a big part to do with that. Sort of like how the education cartel is more or less comes down to teachers' unions. But anyway, not to get into the minutia, I will start to take questions here pretty soon, but I just wanted to give that sort of background and exactly what direction the show is going. All right, thank you for listening to my rant, and I hope you liked it. I recorded that yesterday when I put out the request for questions, and then kind of went about my day. And so some of the questions that came in, coincidentally, I was talking about intellectual property immediately after I had made the posts on social media. I just hopped on the microphone and gave some rough thoughts about what was going on in my head. One of the questions was asked by my friend, Amanda. She asked about just intellectual property in general. I, for the longest time, was pro-IP because I had always had the idea that from this Lockean perspective that you mix your labor with something and that becomes property. But the concept of owning an idea is a little bit too much for me. I'm not sure if I can qualify that you can actually own an idea anymore. It seems a little dubious to say that. And essentially what IP is, if we think about it fundamentally from my perspective, from this basic idea of property rights, you're telling other people that they legally can't rearrange their own resources in particular steps in which you specify. However, at the same time, I can see the demand for IP because people are afraid that the things that they create will just be stolen and redistributed. But it seems to me that even things like copyright, which is probably the hardest thing for me to be against, it seems that it's mostly just a tool for kind of record companies and publishers to make more money. So it seems to me almost that eliminating the copyright system could seem to actually have the opposite effect that people might think that it would, which is to put more power into the hands of the artists and authors directly. And I guess I don't exactly know what would come of eliminating that entire system writ large, but patents are really the big thing that I can totally see us being able to do away with without any sort of huge fear of a negative consequence. All it is institutionalized monopoly of products, and they justify it by saying that you need a temporary monopoly to incentivize innovation. But if you actually know about this whole system and how it works, it actually kills innovation. So it has the opposite of its intended effect. And I do plan on getting a guy named Stefan Kinsella on the show, who is an expert on intellectual property and is actually an intellectual property attorney who sort of speaks about how this just isn't right from a purely ANCAP position. So I just find his analysis pretty compelling, and I've learned a lot from him. And I think I would have to have him, convince me of copyright all the way. So anyway, look forward to getting a hold of him sometime. I think he'd be a really great guest. And I will talk about intellectual property more then. Another question came from a old childhood friend of mine named Tyler. How would libertarianism deal with the tremendous amount of uneven power and influence that the ultra-wealthy have gained under the current government system? So that's part one of his question. Let's see. I could probably just hash this out in two different parts because he asked two different questions. So that's the first question he asked. And the way I would deal with that is to divide the power of the government even further so that we could disenfranchise those uneven power structures that he's talking about. And this is the consequence of big business getting in bed with government. In my opinion, those sort of leviathans cannot survive in an open market. And that's why you don't see some of these big moguls supporting people like Ron Paul and other liberty candidates such as Rand Paul even, Ron's son, who is now the senator of Kentucky, a senator in Kentucky. That's my thoughts on that really in a nutshell, is that I am convinced that they can't survive, and if they can, then they must, if they can in the long term, then they must be able to provide some sort of value to consumers, and that's what keeps them alive. That's what I find so great about the market, is it's the ultimate democratic apparatus that's far removed from this bureaucratic hegemon. And the second part of his question, he asks, what would prevent them from crushing all competition with that tremendous power in a more privatized system? Kind of goes back to exactly what I was just saying, is that I don't think that huge companies could really survive as easily in an environment where they actually can't use this artificial power balance through the state to actually corner their market share illegitimately like they do now. And that's the one thing that people like Tyler, he was a Bernie Sanders supporter in the election, so I think that he certainly has this big concern of large government powers, which I understand, or large capitalist powers, which I can totally understand. Reason being, I used to kind of be a progressive, so I just totally get why he would believe that. And at some point, I think that it's good to have people actually calling that kind of stuff out. No matter how small the government gets, too, from my perspective, there should always be people being skeptical of that. And I believe it's a good thing that people are vigilant of large companies. However, sometimes I just don't agree with the conclusions that they come to and the solutions to whatever problems that we might have. And unfortunately, to me, it seems that it's kind of a double-edged sword, what he's talking about, a bit of a paradox. So how do you stop these huge private entities from becoming powerful once we eliminate the force of government that they've used to leverage power? So this seems like the answer is rather simple, but I understand the caveat that, well, there's not only the government power that they're using. However, things like net neutrality, for example, it seems to me that a lot of these people who are against large companies taking power through lobbying, it's completely lost on them that net neutrality in and of itself is a sort of cronyist system that they're trying to impose. It's no coincidence that large bandwidth consumers such as Netflix are trying to get the cable industry to raise their rates so that Netflix and whatever other services that use a lot of streaming have to raise their rates on their consumers. It's just basically a fight between who is going to have to adjust their price structure for this increased use of bandwidth that technology has sort of created a demand for. So what happens is traffic on the infrastructure of telecom is taxed when there's heavy usage, and they have to put in more repeaters and better fiber if they want to keep customers at a satisfactory level. So that's sort of where the nature of this conflict comes from. But then, there's this whole narrative that what we need it for is to restrict tolling and all of these things that really haven't been an issue really at all besides isolated cases. And in those isolated cases, it's like, yeah, they throttle because they have to, because otherwise the infrastructure will be too taxed and they'll have outages and things like that. So, it's completely understandable from the producer's standpoint in that whole thing. So I hope that answers that question more, and I hope that Tyler will comment on the post for this episode if he wants anything else clarified. And then my friend Amanda asks again another question saying, wondering about how the libertarian philosophy affects my everyday life at home. And that's a really great question because I think that's like a huge part of how this worldview has benefited me. I've decided to do a lot more with my life because of it. That's why I decided to go to a trade school and get a marketable skill, and it's done very well for me. Put in, it was a good investment to go learn these skills and apply them in a marketplace. And it has increased my wealth and my human capital quite a bit. And those kind of economic concepts were really just important for me to develop as an adult. Whereas before, I felt like I was just pointing the finger and making a victim out of myself, which some of the things that I was saying and thinking was true, but I was limiting myself just through the projections of, where I was supposed to go statistically. I dropped out of high school. I was arrested a lot of times for weed. So on paper, it looked like my life wasn't going to mean very much in the future. But I just changed that by adjusting my perception of the things that I do in life to provide for myself and the people that I love. So that's that. And she was, I think, specifically asking about things like with neighbors, which coincidentally, I had just been talking with my neighbors yesterday on issues of cutting down trees. So, had to communicate with neighbors on both sides and ask about, what trees they do or don't want there. And, just being civil and making sure that we have mutual understandings. And I even borrowed a chainsaw from the one neighbor who was nice enough to let me borrow his equipment. So yeah, I think it is a huge part of who I am and has given me a more coherent philosophy in life, really. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So yeah, it's a huge part of my life, more than just this obscure fringe political philosophy. So yeah, all good questions. I also put stuff out on Reddit, and things got a little crazy there. A lot of trolls and whatnot. You get that on Reddit. But one thing someone brought up was abortion. And this is a very hard topic for me personally, because I grew up progressive, so I have a lot of those sort of sympathies for the rights of the mother. But my anti-war sort of inclinations sort of lead me to, well, we should also protect children, right? Because children are the most innocent, the most vulnerable people in our society, and that's just a constant throughout human civilization. So to me, just by actually listening to people on the pro-life side, I can kind of understand where they're coming from. However, I'll ask this to both people on both extremes of the pro-life and pro-choice spectrum, and I never really get a very consistent answer out of either of them, which is, do you really think that a 1-month-old fetus is the same thing as a 8-month-old baby? And I don't think that, unless they're applying some dogmatic standards, that they can answer that question honestly, because I think there is a huge difference, and we all know that it is. This isn't to say that I take away the ethical considerations of the pro-life side, where they say that once an egg is fertilized, that becomes a unique set of genetics, thus a sovereign human with rights. And I just think from a pragmatic standpoint, we can't really apply that standard because it's just not the same thing to me. And this is just one of those things where I kind of divert to utilitarianism and pragmatism, where I sort of don't do that on other things. I have a very strict view of what property rights are. So I admit that this is one of my more waffly things where I sort of accept how you can't really you can't really stop these things. You can try to legislate morality, but you can't. So it seems to me that the ethical prism is what we have to view this from. It seems to me that the best ethical thing to do is to allow for a legal system in which pre-viability abortions are legal. And even within that period, I think that you should have the consent of both parents in that situation if you can. Now, if the father has walked out, then obviously he has neglected his obligation as a guardian and he has no say in the thing. But it seems to me that that's really the best compromise that we could ever have on this issue. I just can't view it from a purely we have to protect the children or we have to protect the women, because that it's a marriage of those two things in a conversation that we have to talk about if we want to be honest. So yeah, I know, not a very good, concise answer, but I think I just hope that I could at least communicate to people that I have the nuance there to understand where each side is coming from, and that I just can't think anything other than pre-viability as the metric for a legal question. But yeah, at the same time, I think we have to be honest about how it's a kind of uncomfortable thing. I mean, it is. I can see the merit of people calling it murder. So, here we are. And one last thing that I want to say before I wrap up here is that a lot of the concerns that I get from other people, both conservative and progressive, it all has to do with how the political ideology that I talk about doesn't have an immediate solution to a lot of the problems that they have immediately, such as the war on terror on the right, such as the problems with poverty and wealth distribution among the classes in America. And it seems like it goes back to a question of time preference, the economic concept of short-term versus long-term means to an end. So because I don't have a solution that appeals to a high time preference schedule, which means that there's a demand for something to get done right away for problems that are more complicated than just changing a government policy and changing it in 3 years or something, that's not how the system works that I envision. It's all about incentivizing behavior around a certain set of principles. So in some way, unfortunately, it relies on convention in that it relies on people adopting these ideas. So that's pretty much what I'm trying to do by engaging in media in the way that I do here. And considering the fact that libertarianism does have a low time preference, as in we are sort of willing to go through short-term consequences and abrupt or acute issues for the long-term goal of just maintaining things in a more just fashion. In the war on terror example, we're willing to deal with the consequences of some blowback and some power vacuums that would be left in the Middle East if we were to pull out our influences and our support. But in the long run, it would kind of be worth it because it doesn't make us a target if we get out of problems there. And I guess if I had to sum it up, the reason why this appeals to me is because I find the low time preference solutions always to be a bit more convincing as far as a sustainable way to manage structure of organizations. I'm going to wrap up there, guys. I talked about a lot of controversial things. I hope that things like this engage audiences and sort of gets me some new interest in the show. So if you like what I'm doing here, hit subscribe. I think I'm going to make a regular thing out of doing this sort of Q&A thing, as well as interspersing it with some interviews. Hopefully I've got some new stuff for you coming here. I really need to get on doing some more interviews, and just watch out for more cool stuff in the future. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe on your way out and find us on Facebook at facebook.com/subversionwebcast.